Well, it wasn't strange for me because, you know, funny enough, when I made my debut, Don never told me I was playing till the Saturday morning. And my mum and dad obviously couldn't get down for Scotland. But it just so happened Frank was staying with me for that weekend in my digs. So Frank was at the game. And, you know, when Frank took the same path as me. So it wasn't a surprise to me when Frank made it into the first team for Leeds, because Frank had a lot of talent. You know, Frank played with the Glasgow schoolboys, Scottish schoolboys. My biggest disappointment at the time was that Frank never went to Celtic. Basically because of my dad as well. You know, because he seen me leaving 7 years earlier. Frank's 7 years younger than me. Frank was a ball boy at Celtic Park. He was Celtic daft. You know, I remember in the early 70s, 60s, I remember we played Celtic, you know, in a friendly, and we beat them up at Celtic Park, and Frank wouldn't talk to me. You know, he wouldn't. He wouldn't talk to me, shut himself in his room, because we'd beat Celtic, because he was a Celtic supporter. Yeah. But the funny thing is, the same scout, John Barr, he did exactly the same thing. He went up to see my mum and dad, and he says, we'd like Frankie down at the weekend, you know, Leeds, and have a look. And I had no influence over Frank coming to Leeds whatsoever, because at that particular time, for my dad's sake, I wanted Frank to go to Celtic. It never happened. So when Frank came to Leeds, obviously, he had talent. He was a midfield player, Frank, as well.
Yep.
I mean, I would have rather seen Frank playing all his career in midfield than playing at left back. Mm-hmm. And no disrespect to Frank or anybody that plays at left back or full back, you know, but I thought Frank had the talent to be, and he did. He played all his games, early games in midfield as a midfield player. I mean, I went to play at left back when I was in my 30s, and I didn't find it difficult. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I used to find it difficult playing there.
Well, I think the thing about it is you know, like, that's why I have great respect for, you know, strikers, because 9 times out of 10 you're playing with your back to the goal, and you've got to be clever enough and quick enough, you know, and have a good knowledge of how to play the game, when to knock it off, when to hold it, when to turn, when to make runs in behind people. But when you're playing, when I found when I was playing at left back, the whole pitch was in front of me. I could see everything. And that makes it a little bit easier, even easier than playing outside left. Yeah. Because when I'm playing outside left, there's people coming up your back and try to give you a whack or whatever. You know, the game's changed now, obviously. They're not allowed to challenge for the back now, but you were then. But Frank became great left back, won the European Cup.
I was going to say, so I guess, and absolutely no disrespect to Frank, who incidentally I've never met, so maybe you could facilitate that, Eddie. Yeah. But definitely no disrespect to Frank, who I again watched from the terraces back in the day. But you would have to be the more famous of two brothers, I would think, in the general footballing public's mind. 12 international caps, Frank, as you say, 30 odd.
Yeah. And won a European Cup.
Yeah, and won a European Cup.
Frank was a great player. Frank played in a terrific Nottingham Forest team.
Yeah.
Played in a great Leeds team. But I mean, I think Frank was always going to be a top player, whoever he played with, or wherever he played, whether it was midfield or, you know, like at fullback, when he made his name, basically.
Yeah.
But I think that's why Frank became such a good footballer, because he had a midfield player's knowledge of how to play the game, he had the talent to play in midfield. So, and he was quick, very quick, Frank. So that argues well for being a good left back. I mean, Terry Cooper had the attributes, you know. Terry wasn't as quick as Frank, but Terry, for his knowledge of playing outside left, probably knew how wingers liked to play and what wingers didn't like. Because, you know, when I went to left back, a bit like Frank, I would think, well, if I was playing against an outside right, it was good in the ball and good at running you, I'm not going to let him do that. I'm going to take him the other way and get forward a lot, which he wouldn't like to defend the goal, you know, and that's his, you know, like, just a little bit of knowledge of how to play and how to, combat your weaknesses,
If you're listening in wondering why we're not going game by game through Eddie's career and all those great matches, I guess those have been covered a lot over the years, and not that I don't want to touch on them when we probably will if they come up in conversation. Yeah. But there's other things as well, other little aspects. I think it might have been when we worked together that evening, where you talked about in training on Fullerton Park, some of the hardest games you ever played in that will never be in the FA record books were England-Scotland, but from the Leeds United squad. When you think about this, the Scottish players you had in the side, surely England couldn't win a game, could they? And where did Johnny Giles fit into all this?
Johnny floated. If there was a man short on one team, Johnny was just playing. No, they were pretty tough games. Yeah. Don stopped them though, because they were getting a bit out of hand.
Did anybody ever miss matches then as a result of injuries from those?
No. But I think Don was fearful it could happen, especially when Bobby was around, and Billy. No, there were some fierce games, and Don called a halt to it. Because even though, we were teammates, there was always that rivalry between England and Scotland,
the home internationals were.
I remember, I've got to say this, people say, like, would you like England to win the World Cup? I remember in 1966, the World Cup final. We were a bit fearful of England winning it and beating Germany. And we went to a hotel round the corner from here called the Faversham.
Okay,
hotel.
Yeah.
Me, Peter and Jimmy Lumsden. And watched the game out in there, so we were right out of the way. Nobody could find us. And we got a bit of ribbon when we went into the club after the World Cup final. When you get a little bit older, you mellow a bit, and you look back on it as a great day for England. But in those days, the rivalry was still very strong. For England to beat Scotland, and you only need to look at the crowds that went to the games. I've been to Hampden Park with 150,000. When I played against England at Hampden Park, 136,000. Yeah. So there was that intense desire to win the games, and even on the training pitch, that it didn't change whether you're playing at Hampden Park, Wembley, or Fullerton Park. You're still playing for Scotland against England.
My dad tells a story that he did his national service in the 50s, and he met a guy who played for 3rd Lanark as part of the cohort, and kept in touch with him. So he went to Hampden for an England-Scotland international, and he said, I never even thought about this at the time, but I was sitting there and England must have gone 1-0 up, and Dad gets off his seat and waves his rattle or whatever, his scarf, and he sort of looked around and realised that you could hear a pin drop where he was sitting.
Must have been a brave man. There was that rivalry. Funny enough, you talk about things like that, and growing up, and that, that's one of the disappointments for me now, is that Scottish football isn't the same now. You mentioned 3rd Lanark then. Third Lanark were a great team. Yep. Hilly, Harley and Gray. That was their inside forward trio, centre forward. Joe McInnes outside left. They had a real top team then. And you look at Scotland now, and the reason I think the Scottish teams are lagging behind, because obviously it's not a level playing field anymore. Yeah. When Celtic won the European Cup, it wasn't a Premier League. It was a level playing field. Celtic could keep all their best players. Now that Celtic have to let their best players go. You actually look, Celtic have always had a great network at producing players and getting players. You go back to Leeds United, and you get Mark Viduka coming for Celtic. Yeah. That would never have happened years ago. And the best centre half in the world in it, Van Dijk, a Celtic player, and he went to Southampton. For a Celtic player to go to Southampton, it just goes to show you how much the game changed from a financial point of view when the Premier League started. And that's a disappointing thing for Scottish football just now, that it's not got that same strength and depth that it had years ago.
Which leads, you alluded to what you were doing on 66 World Cup final day. Of course, Scotland then famously beat England the following year and claim themselves to be world champions. Yeah. completely wrongly.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, we talked about some of the players already, and we've not even mentioned names like Joe Jordan, Gordon McQueen, who come along a little bit later when Frank had sort of joined.
Yeah.
That was a hell of a nucleus of Scottish players mainly in English football, but there were still some players, Danny McGrains and the like, who were playing north of the border.
Well,
74 is what I'm building towards here, Eddie. The 74 World Cup. Was that your big chance? Because that was I know they went out in the group phase, but that was a really good team.
Strong side. I mean, probably the strongest side, on paper that they could have had,
Did you? I know you've been injured most of that season.
I never played in the World Cup final. That was a big regret. I'd like to have. My brother has, Joe has, Peter has, Big Gordon, McQueen. I still speak to them on a regular basis. I spoke to Joe the other day, and Gordon. I think that, and that all happened basically because, like John Barr, the connection, and Bobby Collins with Joe Jordan, told on about this young Scottish player. He's a bit raw, but he turned out to be a top player, and Bobby was proved right, But we had a great tradition of, there was players that came that never made it at the club, and the 60s and the 70s, but they were still coming down Scottish schoolboy internationalists.
You mentioned Jim McCalliog for one. Didn't really make his name at Leeds, did he? But he went on to be, very successful elsewhere.
Yeah, well, Jimmy, see, the thing people don't realise about Jimmy walked out the door. Jimmy left only because it was a bit strange in those days. See, when we signed for Leeds United, we were amateur footballers. We had to sign as amateurs. I mean, when I first came here, I was supposed to be, a motor mechanic.
Right.
And, Peter worked for Petty's Printers. He used to work across the road.
My dad used to work for Petty's Printers.
Well, supposed to. Never seen it. Never been inside. So Jimmy came, with Peter, and the big worry for Don, and it backfired on him with Jim McCalliog because we could walk out the door anytime. We were amateurs. Mm-hmm. Between the ages of 15 and 17, English boys signed apprentice professionals. That tied them to the club, but we weren't allowed to. That was the rules then. We had to sign as amateurs. Yep. So if I was at Leeds United and I'd have went and signed for Farsley Celtic, another amateur club, that was my contract finish with Leeds. I could have walked out the door at any time. So clubs knew this, especially one shrewd manager. He was one of the shrewdest managers of the game. He was manager at Chelsea at the time. The dog. He came. He took Jimmy. He took Jimmy, and what he did, he moved all the McCalliog family to London. Well, all the McCalliog family lived in Leeds anyway, so that was nothing. And he offered Jim's family, a package because he knew he was buying a top class player. And funny enough, I seen Jimmy McCalliog the other day. I was at Bobby Brown's funeral in Scotland. Yeah. The ex-manager who was manager in that 67 game, and Jim McCalliog scored in that game. Jimmy was only 19 then, 19 I think he was then. Jimmy scored in that 3-2 game, scored the winner I think, Jimmy. And I seen Jimmy the other day, not seen him for years, lives up in Scotland now. But and even before I was 17, Celtic come back to me, a couple of other clubs come back, and it would have been the same with Peter, because he knew we were amateurs. So Don had to work hard and to keep the Scottish boys. And then it changed, they could become apprentices. When Frank came, they could become an apprentice professional, like the rest of the English boys. But for the first few years, like with Jim McCalliog, myself, and Peter especially, Don would have been in like tenderhooks, just looking at people like Tommy Dock and you, because Tommy tried to get me as well when I was in between 15 and 17.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing you saying that before, yeah. You are listening to Sporting Lives, by the way, myself, Jonathan Doidge, and my special guest today is Eddie Gray, great of Leeds United and Scotland fame. Thanks again to Ian Holding and ICS for allowing me to record this podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Jonathan Doidge with any thoughts you've got on future guests or any questions you might have for future guests, or at jd@jonathandoidge.com. So let's get to the nitty-gritty, Eddie. You're going to have to disappoint a few of your mates here. You've got 11 men to walk out on the field. You're one of them. So who's the other 10 best players you played with?
Well, it's a difficult one now because...
No fence sitting, please.
No. I will sit in the fence on this one in a way. Because, silly enough as it seems, people always say Sprake, Reina Cooper, Bremner, Charlton, Hunter, Lorimer, Clark, Jones, Giles and Gray. And I always say to them, where's Paul Madeley?
Yeah.
Paul Madeley played 700 games. Paul Madeley would be in the team. I'm not saying where he'd be in the team, but it'd be centre back, right back, left back, midfield, even played centre forward at times, Paul Madeley. Paul was a great, great player. So I would say...
Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll do 12 men then.
Yeah.
Because we'll accept that on any given day, one of those might have a tweak.
Well, Paul Reina broke his leg, played a lot of games at right back. Terry Cooper broke his leg, played a lot of games at left back. I was injured at times. He would play midfield then. Sit midfield. If Mick Bates never played, Paul would play midfield. In the early days, played centre forward at times. I think when we played against Burnley, when I scored the 2 goals, I think Paul Madeley was playing centre forward, I think, that day.
Really?
I think so.
Yeah. So he's in. And is it the rest that you just listed? Aside from that, is Gary Sprake in there ahead of David Harvey, for example? Or David Stewart?
That's a difficult one because in his younger days, and I'm going back to when I first came to the club, I don't think I've ever seen a better natural goalkeeper than Gary Sprake. Natural goalkeeper. He could do everything. Great hands. But then, when the media get involved heavily, and I mean games been televised on a regular basis, he found it difficult, Gary. David was a different type of goalkeeper. I think David was the most solid goalkeeper at the end of the day, for the point of view, he was more like a Gordon Banks type of goalkeeper, a Nigel Martin.
Yeah.
Never made many errors, steady. Maybe not as flamboyant, but
not famous for his howlers on television.
No, and that's what done Gary at the end of the day. But I remember, you go back to the first cup. If Gary wouldn't have been playing that night, Hungary, we would get beat. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. So at his best, I would say he was as good as any goalkeeper I've seen.
High praise. And, I'm just talking pure football as well, not to do with the stuff that was said and that sort of thing later on, just purely as footballers. And David Harvey was around at the era when Cloughy came to the club.
Yeah.
So Don's decided to call time on an amazing time.
Yeah.
There doesn't look to have been at that stage massive succession planning, but he has brought in Joe Jordan, Trevor Cherry's come along, Gordon McQueen's playing by that stage.
Yeah.
So there is some progression. But
Yeah. I think I don't think Don relished the thought of certain players coming towards the end of their career and having to move them on. I think that's, I never really spoke to him about it, but I think that's one of the reasons he decided it was time for him to go.
That's an interesting character study of him, isn't it? Because of what he's done, and he's invested so much kind of love in that team, that squad,
and the club.
And the club, he can't bring himself to break that up. So there's an element of soft centre to that, isn't there? Really, when he was always sort of known for having quite a hard exterior.
On the outside, but Don looked after the players and their families. If there was anything and the kids were ill, or your wife or someone, they try and make sure they get best treatment. He looked after the players, Don. And I think, I'm not saying that was the reason that he left, But I think it would have been a factor, that breaking up a team that had, and people talk about the 10 years, but it was before the 10 years as well. You go back to the early 60s when he took over, and he gets all these young boys in, including myself, 1962 when I first joined the club in 63, Peter 62, and the boys before that, a few of the boys were at the club, but he grew up with them as young men, and developed into what they became, some of the household names throughout the country from a footballing point of view. So I think that would have disappointed them to see players having to move on. And eventually the club, obviously, the team had to break up. Age doesn't wait for anybody. Time stands still for no man.
So, without making this just one sweeping response to one question about what's happened since, the European Cup final in 1975, but what about those intervening years? Yeah, there was the Howard Wilkinson Championship side after you'd finished playing, but your involvement, as a player, you mentioned moving to left back, and then of course managing the club, player managing, back again as youth team coach, reserve team coach. Can you take us sort of briefly?
Well, when Don left the club, obviously I was having problems, injury. I played, as I mentioned before, in the Charity Shield for Brian. I think the club, I don't think it's any secret, the club told Johnny Giles he was getting a job, and then it just fell apart through circumstances, and they got Brian. I think if Brian would have came with Peter Taylor, it might have been different for him, because I think Peter Taylor, I've watched documentaries on Brian and a few incidents in tunnels and that. You can see Peter Taylor pull him away and tell him to calm down.
So he'd have been the voice of reason in Brian's head when he was firing off at people like you and saying...
Yeah, everybody. Just how he come in. I think if Peter had been there, I get the impression he could just pull the reins in on him. Because he was a fiery character, obviously one of the greatest managers this country's produced. Yeah. When you look at his record, Derby County, Nottingham Forest, won 2 European Cups with Forest.
Can't argue.
It's incredible. But when he came to our club, it was the wrong time for him. And yet, I don't think what he could understand is that how Don's team had just won the league and won the league comfortably. And when Jimmy Armfield came in and Jimmy steadied the ship, Jimmy was a different type of manager to Don and Brian. Jimmy was quiet. Jimmy didn't like a lot of confrontation. Where that didn't bother Don, it didn't bother Brian especially. Yeah. But I think it just goes to show you that Brian just never did it right. Because Jimmy took the team to the European Cup final that year and beat a lot of good sides. Should probably won the European Cup final, but unlucky not to win it. So Jimmy was a bit unlucky for that point of view. But then Jimmy transformed the club in a way, bringing new players in. But it was always going to be difficult, regardless of who you brought in. He brought in some terrific players. Some great players came at the club, I mean, Tony Curry was a terrific player at the football club. You had a young Ray Hankin, who was one of the best centre forwards around then. He had a lot of players. Arthur Graham coming down for Scotland. Arthur was a terrific player. So, but to replace the players, or to try and replace the players that had left the club, was always going to be very difficult. Because, I grew up with Don Revy's team, but I also played with all the players I've mentioned, and they were great players. But were the midfield players as good as Brendan and Giles? In my opinion, no. And that's no disrespect to them, because I'm talking about two of the greatest players that played the game. So that was always going to be difficult for any manager to come in to replace and try and get their days back. Howard's team was the great team. And they had, the nucleus of that side, and I don't think I'm out of place in saying this, it was the midfield area. Yeah. When you get Strachan, Batty, McAllister and Speed. So they were a very, very strong outfit. They had other players as well, no doubt about it. Rod Wallace, Chapman, even look at the defenders, you Tony Dorigo, you had a lot of good players. So Mel Sterling come in and up and down the flanks, your two centre backs who, strong, they just did their jobs. So they were obviously a terrific side.
But you're backing your lot to beat them.
I would have backed our team
Over
to
two
beat.
legs.
I would have backed our team to beat any team.
Yeah.
On the day.
Sure.
On the day, I would have done. I mean, when we played in the semi-final of the European Cup, and we played against the great Barcelona team, Cruyff and Neeskens and players like that. Ellen Road, we should have won the game 4 or 5. You know, on our day we were as strong as any team that played. I mean, I look back now and I see some articles for old players. I was reading an article the other week, and it was a few of the Chelsea players, and it was Ron Chopper Harris, and it says Leeds United are the best team I ever played against. So that says everything of the team.
And Eddie Gray's not given me my studs back yet.
yeah, correct. And then the team moved on, and obviously Jimmy Adamson came in, and Dave Merrington worked with Jimmy. I think it was a bit difficult with Jimmy, I think, because Jimmy never used to come out of the training park much, which I found strange, because when you spoke to Jimmy Adamson, he had a great knowledge of how to play the game. He spoke well about the game. But we would have a team talk on a Saturday, and it would be something like completely different to what we'd been working on the training pitch. And I found that a bit strange, and I think that's why it never worked for Dave and Jimmy. Although they were a partnership, they seemed to be at times pulling different direction. Yeah. The two of them had good knowledge of the game, but Dave took all the training, and Jimmy would be in the office, and then Jimmy would take the team talk on a Saturday. It was just a bit strange, And then obviously Alan came in, and Alan took over, and it was Alan basically put me to play in a defensive position and left back, and which I enjoyed. And then like Alan got the sack and I took over, and the club hadn't a lot of money, and that was difficult. But we had a lot of good young players that went on to make good careers for themselves. You likes of Scott Sellers and Tommy Wright, John Sheridan, who everybody knows. John was a big favourite at football club, and John stayed on at the club and played after I left. Andy Linnigan, who went to the Arsenal, and obviously Dennis Irwin, who won so many trophies at Manchester United, Terry Phelan. We two goalkeepers. One I let go, with John Lukic, obviously, and with Big Dave Seaman. And I had 2 young goalkeepers at the time, and the two of them went on to have great careers. Dave, went on to have a terrific career, as everybody knows. But that particular time, I felt that John was the strongest goalkeeper, and I got Dave Harvey back just as a strong backup. Yeah. And Dave eventually played, and I got Peter back as well to help the young boys, and Peter did a terrific job in the 80s. But the club wanted to move forward quicker than I was taking them, and they got Billy in, and Billy was a bit unfortunate, the playoff games. And,
semi-final.
And then Howard came in, and they found a bit of money, and they brought players in, and Howard spent the money wisely, and the players they brought in, and they were a terrific side. But their side broke up pretty quickly. The game was beginning to change then. Players moving on, agents getting involved in the game, and it made it more difficult for anybody.
And that was obviously that was an absolute cut-off anyway from First Division to Premier League football when they won the title, wasn't it? Obviously we've talked about your involvements. You're still involved now as an ambassador, and apart from retaining the Glaswegian accent, you could not be more Leeds, I don't think, than those of us who were born within the city. You're an obvious love for the city, a love for the club. Does that, how big a disappointment then for you was it, what happened in the early 2000s with the Champions League semi-final and then the breakup of all that?
He spoke, Jonathan, about a disappointment. From a playing point of view, disappointment is obviously my thigh, because I think I would have been a better player. I don't mind saying that. I would have been a better player. But my biggest regret at the football club was actually going back as caretaker manager. Trevor Birch, who was running basically the club at that time, came to see me and asked me to get back, told me the circumstances, but then I went back as caretaker and we got relegated. Now, I look back in that time and I still think I could have done more in myself.
Yeah.
But it wasn't an easy situation. I mean, they were selling players left, right, and centre, and asking players to take a wage cut. A new regime come in who. It wasn't a good time to work at a football club, let's put it that way. And we got relegated. But going back then, it was a wrong decision I made to go back. I know I'd left the club and went to manage other clubs, because that happens in football. Went to Rochdale where I enjoyed my time, went to Hull City for a season, then I come back and worked for George first, and the youth team. Well, I come back to work for Howard first, for the youth team with Paul Hart. Howard asked me back, and we worked in, and all these young players come through. We won the Youth Cup with tremendous players, with Q and Woodgate,
Ian
was
Hart,
terrific, Ian Hart and Stephen McPhail. We had lots of players, and Paul Robinson played in goal. You had a lot of international players, but they all come through the system, and I enjoyed that time. But they're the two biggest regrets that I've had since I came to the club when I was 15. Getting my thigh injury when I was 16, and getting back as caretaker manager. Because even though I knew it was difficult, and I never realised how difficult it was going to be till I get back in. And that's when I regretted my decision. I thought, I made the wrong move here. I could only see the club going well, because there's no investment coming into the club.
Yeah.
And it was a difficult time for everybody at the club, and I'm including the players in this. Because players would come in and say to me, the club tried to sell me last night. I says, how do you know? Because my agent told me. That's how it was. So, and asking players to take wage cuts, defer wages, and then there'd be a split in the camp. Some were willing to do it, some were willing to go. I wouldn't mention any names, but that's just how the club was. Everybody was pulling in different directions, including the people that were in charge at that particular time. I think they were all pulling in different directions for each other. And that made it difficult as well.
Eddie, it's been an absolute pleasure again to relive some of those great moments, and to find out a bit more as well about your backstory and the Leeds United and Scotland, those great years. So many thanks for your time. Thanks for being on Sporting Lives. It's been a pleasure.